And lo, it shall pass that the reviewer can't get off level 1, and he shall not care for the game, or want to play it for more than 20 minutes. But lo, he shall be fearful of the software company dropping advertising and missing him off the free crate of beer list at Christmas, and he shall tremble and quake mightily, as all rival mags have given it a high score. So, he shall give it a score low enough to dissuade potential buyers, yet high enough to pacify the software people. And that score shall be the number of the beast, and it shall be 73%.
Today's Defendant, Amiga Power, Issue 3, July 1991. The game, Prehistorik. Court is in session. Wait, Amiga Power? Yep, the magazine that exposed the conspiracy may have been guilty of historic crimes itself. In its first 9 issues, Amiga Power gave no less than 12 73% reviews, 8 of which were for newly published games. A class action special episode trial is clearly called for, but the prosecution has chosen to bring this one as a sample charge. Prehistorik itself is one of a group of vaguely dinosaurs lived at the same time as humans genre platformers from around this time. You'll probably remember Bonk, aka PC Kid or BC Kid, but that's a couple of years older. The Amiga port, however, wouldn't appear until the year after this issue, by which time it was not only competing with Prehistorik, but also Toki and Chuck Rock, all 3 of which released on the Amiga in early 1991. Prehistorik was developed and published by Titus in France, whose record is a little bit iffy on occasion to say the least. It was they who were responsible for the war crime that was Superman 64, for instance. Although they would enter games like Crazy Cars 3, the most overlooked driving game on the Amiga, in mitigation. These 3 similar themed games were released very, very close together. Toki so much so that it shares this issue of Amiga Power with Prehistorik, and Chuck Rock is only 2 months older, being part of the lineup for the initial issue of the magazine. So how does Prehistorik stack up, and how honestly did AP review it? To find out, I think we need to look at all 3 games. So we start with the first one released, Chuck Rock. This is probably the most famous of the 3, having been released for essentially everything, including Archimedes, the Master System but not the NES, and for some reason 2 of the later CD-based systems. The plot is from the very small book of early platform games. You know that wife of yours? Kidnap mate. You see, Chuck Rock is the lead in a band. Rock, you see, like those things he chucks. Because it's the past. Anyway, your rival band leader, the spectacularly badly aged pun Gary Gritter, has kidnapped the missus, and Chuck's off to put this right. This got the best reception of our trilogy, a full 86% from future transphobia rights activist Stuart Campbell. The intro is super impressive, if about as progressive as a broken down transit van with a copy of The Sun on the dashboard. The game itself is a sedate kind of platformer with a very well realised world. I'm not going to disagree with the score, but briefly I feel it's not aged well, with its small viewpoint, absurdly specific timing needed to get even the lowest level enemies, and a massively far apart checkpoint system. It also doesn't have any music, hence this very pleasant royalty-free bed we're using. Between these failures, and an intro that I think Core created the character of Lara Croft purely to atone for, it is the poster child for game of its time. Toki 2 has been around a bit, starting as this arcade game before being ported to most places, including the NES, but not the Master System, just to be a bit contrary. You'll never guess the plot. I'm actually serious. You'll get the kidnapped girlfriend bit straight off, because of course his sodding girlfriend gets sodding kidnapped because apparently all the video game plot writers in this era were the people who weren't able to manage the narrative depth required to write for porn. What you might not realise is the kidnapper is apparently a witch doctor who turns you into a gorilla for good measure. This is communicated in an intro that, to be super polite, is less impressive than Chuck Rock's. But I'll be damned if it doesn't get the point across in 5 seconds pretty succinctly. Amiga Power said Chuck Rock was probably too easy, but that's never going to be a problem here. Toki is an arcade game through and through and will kill you in one hit under any circumstances. Sometimes those are particularly unfair, like dropping down a blind chasm straight into an enemy, but even so I immediately enjoyed this a lot more. It might do better for better controls than me using an Amiga emulator with the joypad, where it was all too easy to jump when I didn't entirely want to. But even so, I got a bit further with almost every go, and that's what you want. Toki, of course, shared this issue with Prehistorik, and while our featured game was getting the dreaded mark of the beast, this was picking up a healthy 87% and coming perilously close to being game of the issue. I can see that, especially with access to a considerably better joystick than I had. And even with the dreaded up to jump, which, to be fair, is a problem shared with all of these games. Prehistorik, you have to imagine, was inspired by Toki, whose arcade appearance had been a couple of years earlier. In proper Stone Age trope, you are literally a bloke with a club hunting food. But on the plus side, at least you're not hunting any kidnapped women of any description. The food hunting is important. You're required to not only traverse the level, but also to collect sufficient food before you exit it. Food can be many things. Mostly it's going to be defeated enemies. Ian Prehistorik isn't fussy. He'll eat dinosaur, bear, or even bat. He's also quite happy to pick up food lying on the ground in a seemingly mostly abandoned cave. Presumably, he's a big believer in the 5 Ice Ages rule. Defeating the enemies is a little frustrating. Your only method is your low-range club, and some enemies can take 5 hits to dispatch. With little feedback from the very limited sound effects, it's not always obvious if you're even doing any damage, and it becomes really difficult when you get to enemies that fire at you, some of which are irritatingly invincible, which there's no feedback for either, of course. And that's going to be the pattern here. Prehistorik's design feels very 8-bit. Whereas Chuck Rock was a game of its time, and certainly made a fair number of mistakes, Prehistorik hasn't learnt that much from the half-decade prior to its creation. Let's be kind to it first. It's a very expansive game. The levels are huge, albeit there's only really 4 of them, with 3 boss levels as numbers 2, 4 and 6. This weirdly means I'm told the game ends on level 7 without a final encounter, which is a strange narrative decision. I certainly didn't see for myself. Prehistorik is difficult, in a way I imagine that would please the skilled gamer that coughed up £26. If you don't finish it in the first day, it's probably going to be the kind of thing that takes you some time. There's also a lot to explore. Most of the caves can be walked into, there's underwater sections, and a good amount of height in the levels at various points. The enemy variety isn't too bad for a game of this era either, and the fact you don't appear to need all the food available means you can approach completing a level at least broadly in a style that suits you. Okay, that's the nice bits over with. Time to point out some errors. The first, and most noticeable, is the repetitive nature of the combat. I know that Mario and Sonic aren't exactly super diverse, but virtually everything here walks on the ground and you hammer fire until it stops walking on the ground before moving over them to collect their delicious food flesh. Your life force comes in the form of a finite energy bar, and just about everything will sap it. There's spikes in the ground, which you might think are just background detail until you run over them. There's fires in the caves, and there's any number of enemy actions. And this is an issue because the platforming is clunky. Your jump is pathetic, and even clearing a cave fire requires a pretty much pixel-perfect leap. Jumping across the waterfalls without being clunked by the fish is a perfect timing affair, and falling into the water here is fatal. Speaking of fatal, this brings me to another fatal failing we also saw back with Castellian, and we call the Rick Dangerous effect. Stuff you can't possibly figure out by anything other than repetition and luck. In Castelian, it was the otherwise normal platforms that fall out from under you. Here, it's almost the opposite. Because I say the water is fatal, and the two here with fish jumping up are. This first one, though, is not only unfatal, but contains a huge pile of food, all of which will make finishing the level much easier, and all of which Ian is apparently also willing to eat. How you find any of this out without, as I did, missing the first jump through idiocy, I have no idea. So fine. We explore every cave, every hole, kill every creature, and then make our way to the end of the level. "Ah no," says the game, "that's too easy. I'm also going to put a massively restrictive time limit on you such that you could never hope to explore everything in the level." I never like a game that puts one too many restrictions in your way. Is it an explore and find game? Or is it a speed one? Choose. Having the timer makes the exploring pointless. Having to collect virtually every item in the level makes the time limit pointless. And given how sluggish the action is, this should not be a speed game, and it makes the already tricky platforming an urgent affair, which does not help things at all. You've probably noticed already, but then there's the scrolling. Here is Chuck Rock when you move sideways. Here is Toki likewise. Here is Prehistorik. It's 1991. Computers can do scrolling. This is Shadow of the Beast on the same hardware. It was 2 years old at this point. It is also a shite hawk of a game, do not at me, but look at that scrolling in the backgrounds. Researching further, it seems Prehistorik started life as a game in ST basic utility Estos, which doesn't support doing this properly. I'm not sure why I'd care about that if I was on the ST spending £26, much less an Amiga. It's lazy, and if something is in the wrong place on the next screen, it's also fatal. At this point, I feel I'm holding the thing down and giving it a good kicking, but I've got two more things you should know. These old dudes are your only route to bonuses, but they're on screen for about 3 milliseconds, and if you're not there, you miss out. Said bonuses and new weapons disappear when you die or finish the level anyway, presumably because they couldn't be bothered to balance the game for a varied loadout. But okay, long, varied levels, that's good. I finished one, and I'll come back later. No, I won't. There's no saving mechanism, just like with Days of Thunder. No password, no save disk. There wasn't even a level skip cheat in the game, or at least not one anyone's found in the last 29 years. Still, despite all this, it's not worthless. There's the core of something in this game. There's a slightly more streamlined sequel that has a DS port. I might have to give that a go. This? There's too many frustrations. I'm not thinking it was a 73% even without Toki and to a lesser extent Chuck Rock existing. If you're choosing between this and Toki in July 1991, then it's not even a discussion. So here we are. I'm rating a game lower than the rabid Rottweilers at Amiga Power. And on a game reviewed by their esteemed launch editor Matt Bilby no less. I'm sure he has a really good excuse for passing over the numerous failings I've mentioned here. Let's take a look. And you may be seeing where this is going. He doesn't, of course. He does catch the scrolling. You could hardly miss it, after all. He catches that you have to collect almost all the food in the level, and that it would be annoying doubling back. Although, apparently he failed to notice that the time limit would make that impossible anyway. And apparently the game is a little repetitive. That's it. I've played this game for considerably less time than I'd expect a professional reviewer to. Not a word about the clunky platforming, the telepathy-required level design, the lack of saving, or the fussy graphical design hiding lethal obstacles. And it's not a lack of space. The first third of the review is a combination of meaningless filler fluff about the other two games I mentioned, and a retelling of the story. Yes, I did both of those things, but I have infinite space, and you'll notice this is the longest episode of the season to accommodate that. Given a word count, I'm keeping the brass tacks. At the risk of this episode turning into a best-of for the entire series and making it look like my planning skills are much, much better than they actually are, having seen faults from Castellian and Days of Thunder, here's one from the Gunstar Heroes review. The mind-boggling comparison. Of all the games in this world he thinks this feels like, it's a Super Mario game. I'm sorry, but no. Mario has very few ladders and a lot more actual platform skills. You also don't club dinosaurs to death and eat them. Mario has no requirements to exit levels. Mario is faster in almost any incarnation. I've got the footage of Mario 3 from episode 4 handy. Look at this. It's just not similar, is it? He's gone, it's a platformer, sort of. Let's compare it to another popular platformer. It is, I grant you, much more platformer than Gunstar Heroes is, but then so is Stunt Car Racer. I keep returning to that score. Why did, a few years later, Amiga Power call 73% out specifically? Why did they use it more than once an issue for a year and then, coincidentally, as Matt came to the end of his tenure, stop almost completely? Why do they refer to the issues under Matt Bilby as the Golden Age, in a tone that very much suggests they do not mean any sort of trophy? It's all reasonable doubt though. Or is it? The prosecutors have saved their smoking gun for the end. This is the cover for Amiga Power issue 3. Ignore how absolutely god-awful their covers were in general in this early era, and cast those peepers over to the cover disc. Oh hello. This isn't looking good. And it doesn't get any better when we get to the first paragraph of the review, which begins with Matt saying it's odd he's reviewing this since you can just decide for yourself. Which is a red flag for lazy, incompetent reviewing, and more to the point proves he knew they had the demo secured for the cover before writing the review. It gets worse on re-release too. Amiga Power, perhaps pleading the fifth, never reviewed it on budget. But the one in Amiga Action did. Amiga Action gave it 53%, and the one, 30%. The one, 30%. They've given bricks through their office window higher scores than that. It didn't clear 40% from Amiga Force either, and CU Amiga only stretched to 59. Suspiciously, all but Amiga Action had given it either 72 or 73% on original release. A remarkable display of unity. Amiga Action's original 85% review is a complete disgrace that might as well have been replaced by a signed confession. It's a 3-page review that literally doesn't mention the actual game until halfway through page 3. The rest merely describes the premise. It all adds to the growing suspicion that arms were twisted in all directions for this title. The jury does not need long on this one. Amiga Power, I find you guilty of corrupt reviewing to please a publisher. In light of your subsequent good record and turning whistleblower, I sentence you to time served. But Mr. Beelby, take him away. Court dismissed.